Good evening and welcome to your library. I'm David Leonard, President of the Boston Public Library, and I would just like to welcome you here this evening to this great in-person event that our colleagues and friends have planned. The formal land acknowledgement for the library acknowledges that the Boston Public Library's central library stands on land that was once a water-based ecosystem, providing sustenance for the indigenous Massachusetts people. The library's theme for its major programs and events this year is that of climate justice and climate action. And for these reasons, we are doubly pleased to be joined by so many familiar leaders and an exciting program for the evening that includes not just the head of the Boston Groundwater Trust, Executive Director Christian Simonelli, but the library's own Garrett Nelson, President and Head Curator of the Leventhal Map and Education Center here. Tonight's program will run about 2 hours, and while there will not be a formal Q&A planned, attendees are encouraged to ask questions during the brief reception at the conclusion of the event. Any questions collected online, yes, this is a hybrid event tonight, and they will be relayed to the presenters after the event. Please note in advance, of course, that the library closes at 8 o'clock tonight, so we advise you to be on your way by 7:45. We would like to acknowledge the role of the Boston Groundwater Trust in preservation of our historic buildings. Our own central library here sits on pylons that you will learn a lot more about tonight than perhaps you expect. But now, to get the program started officially, and to welcome our own champion of Boston's Green New Deal agenda, please welcome to the podium the two co-chairs of the Boston Groundwater Trust, Gary Saunders and Robert Whitney.
Hi, my name is Gary Saunders, and I represent the Back Bay Association on the Groundwater Trust. Groundwater's sort of been part of my life growing up. Our family has owned and operated the Lenox Hotel since the early 1960s. And I remember as a kid going into the basement with a dipstick with the engineer to check the level of the groundwater under the hotel, because the Lenox is built on wooden piles. The Groundwater Trust was reestablished in 1997 after a hiatus of a number of years. And 20 years ago, roughly, and Tim Mitchell, my co-chair for many years, may have a better idea on the date, but we were fortunate enough to lobby and get funding from the state to install a network of wells, close to 800 wells, in the city of Boston, in areas that were landfill, and you'll find out more about that and how that was done. We've got a really informative program here tonight. And you know, our mission is all about saving and preserving historic neighborhoods, and you know, solutions that we work together with on city and state agencies and utilities to fix and find and fix problems that are taking groundwater out of the system and putting them into sewers or other places is a collaborative effort that we're really proud to be involved with. So I'd like to introduce my co-chair, Rob Whitney, and take it from there.
Thank you. Thanks, Gary. I'm Rob Whitney. I'm the representative on the trust from the Beacon Hill Civic Association. Beacon Hill is another historic district, one of the oldest historic districts in the city, and a national landmark district as well. People forget, although it's Beacon Hill, there's a substantial lower section of Beacon Hill as well on the flats, which is like most of Back Bay is also built on wooden pilings as well. In fact, one of the major instigators, I would say, of sort of the Groundwater Trust original mission was the fact that a lot of the homes on the flat of Beacon Hill were actually beginning to subside and go into the ground itself. So I think almost all of the buildings there now are underpinned as a result of that with new pylons because of that. We're very happy today to have as our introductory speaker the mayor of Boston, Michelle Wu. She is the daughter of immigrants, Boston public schools mom for 2 boys, an MBTA commuter, and a fierce believer that we can solve our deepest challenges through building community. As mayor, she has been successfully working to deliver bold, systematic change to make Boston a city for everyone and all neighborhoods. I have known the Mayor Wu for many years, and I am so pleased that she could join us this evening. She's been a voice for accessibility, transparency, and community engagement in city leadership. She was first elected to the Boston City Council in November 2013, and she is the first Asian American woman to serve on the council. In January 2016, she was elected president of the City Council by her colleagues in a unanimous vote, and she was the first woman of color to serve as the council president. She graduated from Harvard College and Harvard Law School and lives with her family in Rosendale. Mayor Wu has also become known as the environment mayor, who in her campaign and as its mayor has focused on addressing environmental issues for all of Boston residents as part of her Boston Green New Deal initiative, including the hiring of the city's first director of green infrastructure, who you will hear of her about and from a little bit later. Part of the mayor's environmental program is Climate Ready Boston, the city's ongoing efforts to prepare for sea level rise, coastal storms, extreme precipitation, extreme heat and drought, and other climate change impacts. Making Boston climate change ready and how we must deal with the effects of climate change on the groundwater levels below much of downtown Boston, including right here, is one of the reasons why we are all here this evening. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Mayor Michelle Wu.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to our co-chairs for your leadership. Thank you, Gary, for being so tapped in and for continuing the family legacy of supporting our city, and Rob for all your leadership in the neighborhoods, and for your very generous introduction, which I will deduct from my total allotted time because it went into a lot of the great content that I'm glad that is already making an impact. So pleased to see members of our of course, under Christian's leadership, the members of the Board of Trustees of the Groundwater Trust and of our city departments. Thank you, John Sullivan, for your work, and so many others associated with the Boston Water and Sewer Commission who carry this out every day across our city, residents from all of our neighborhoods, and of course my colleagues in government. Really pleased and honored to be here alongside those you'll hear from shortly as well, but State Senator Lydia Edwards, City Council President Ed Flynn, our former colleague Matt O'Malley. We cherish his time on the council, now in an important leadership role in the climate community. State Representatives Aaron Michaelwitz and Jay Livingstone, and City Councilor Kenzie Bach. Thank you so much for all you do on every single day. And to our host, David Leonard. We've gotten to spend a good amount of time together recently. There have been some incredible new announcements here at the library, ribbon cuttings and openings. And if you haven't had the chance to check out the rare books collection, which is now revamped and reopened, it is right in this building, and such a treasure to be able to open that fully to the public. It is treasures like this, like the institutions that hold our cities and our country's intellectual history, treasures like the homes and historic buildings that are still the lifeblood of our neighborhoods, that this organization and this effort seeks to protect. We all know a bit of Boston's history and how many centuries of changes to the land came with pretty serious interventions, so that we are today a city that has been a safe harbor, and our relationship with the water has always defined us. But today, a third of the broadly defined downtown area is built on landfill, which means that as the waters rise across the world and the seas, Mother Nature is looking to take back what was originally hers. And this community and this commission, I think, has truly shifted the conversation to say this: we need to have a public effort, a common good associated with how we address the built environment together, so that the burden doesn't fall only on those who can afford it versus those who can't. This is an effort that the entire city is taking on, and with partners across the region. I want to thank also for highlighting already our city's first ever Director of Green Infrastructure, Kate England, who will be on the panel in a little bit. In fact, I first met Kate at a Boston Groundwater Trust meeting alongside Christian 5 years ago. She was then at Water and Sewer and giving a presentation about the various benefits of green infrastructure and how the commission was leading the way in partnership with different departments in the city, how we can recharge our groundwater, but also remove pollutants, reduce urban heat islands, boost biodiversity, and increase our tree canopy. I was hooked and vowed that if I ever had the chance, I would do whatever I could to make sure Kate had even more of a platform to do this work. And we're so thrilled. You'll see exactly why I'm so excited she's back with the city. And in fact, that summer before I met Kate was Boston's driest summer ever recorded up until that point. We know how big of a problem drought is for groundwater levels and how much our changing climate and heat in particular is affecting so many aspects of our daily lives and the health and safety of our residents. This last summer, this year, we experienced intense drought once again. And the numbers and the kind of drought levels were on par with 2016, which had set records previously. But the difference is, one big difference was that our groundwater levels in Boston today are higher than they were in 2016. And I think that just goes to show all of the parcel by parcel interventions, the citywide focus, the collaboration, and the constant perseverance by Christian and the team to keep this on everyone's radar has paid off and has made a difference. We have a lot more work to do, but we can already see just how much it is working. In the last 6 years, as Boston has continued to experience hotter summers, more intense droughts, and stronger storms, this group has recognized the need to do so much more across the GCOD, the Groundwater Conservation Overlay District, and across our entire city. And so the Trust has adapted to meet the urgency of this moment, shifting from not only monitoring groundwater levels, which has also expanded, but spearheading interventions, building partnerships, and engaging in direct education and advocacy work. Since 2016, the Trust has installed thousands of new green infrastructure projects. The city and Water and Sewer have led the way, from tree pits and gravel filters to rain gardens and bioswales. And we know that the same presentation that Kate was giving, evangelizing about the importance of groundwater and green infrastructure all those years ago, is more relevant than ever. Because these installations don't just bring groundwater back where it belongs, preserving the piles on which so many of our structures are built, they also prevent pollutants from being washed out into the harbor. They sustain our trees, they keep our neighborhoods cooler, and make our communities healthier and more beautiful. And so we're really trying to capture not only the sense that there's a ticking clock and Boston has a lot of work to do for the health and safety and the harms we need to avoid, but in fact, there's so much opportunity and good and community available if we can lean into making this tangible and real for everyone. We're building out our team. We've added our Green New Deal director, Oliver Sellers Garcia, who told me he was on the way, but the MBTA was running late. So we still need a little more work to do there as well. And we're also working across all of our departments. Our Office of Emergency Management is partnering with the Environment Department and Boston Public Health Commission on an extreme temperatures task force. The BPDA, the Boston Planning and Development Agency, is leading net zero zoning, integrating heat resilience into design guidelines, and the Coastal Flood Resiliency Zoning Overlay District design standards. Our Public Facilities Department is building net zero climate resilient buildings and working with our energy team to retrofit existing buildings. Our Transportation Department is working with the Environment team to bring resilience and cooling strategies to transportation corridors, like the ones funded by the RAISE grants that have been available for Blue Hill Ave and in Roxbury, and all of the partnerships and infrastructure funding that the state and our partners at the legislature have made available as well. And of course, we've launched a Green New Deal for Boston Public Schools, meaning a $2 billion commitment as a first phase to facilities renovations that will capture the shared goods of energy efficiency, healthy and clean buildings, and inspiring places to learn for our students. We've undertaken climate resiliency renovations at Moakley and McConnell Parks, released our heat resilience and coastal resilience plans, and tomorrow we're releasing our urban forestry plans. We'll be talking a lot more about trees very soon. We are doing all of this because we know that climate change is threatening to erode more than just our wooden piles. It's compromising the health of our communities and our economy, and the actions we take today will determine the livability of our city and our world for generations to come. I see my little guy staring off in boredom, but we're doing this for him and all of us, and I'm so happy that he's here with me. A challenge of this size and scale affects all of us and demands solutions at the same size and scale that require all of us. Moving forward, we'll continue to collaborate across city government and also with property owners and developers, community organizations and advocates, our leaders and friends at the state and federal levels, and with everyone in this room. Together, we can make Boston the greenest city in the country and one whose future is as bright as our foundations are strong. So thank you so much, and I'm incredibly honored to be here and to keep supporting this effort.
The Environment Mayor, as I said. Incredible. Thank you so much, Mayor. It was wonderful remarks. I'd like to briefly invite up some of our elected officials who came this evening. If you could all come up here to give just some brief remarks. I think we have Kenzie Bach, our City Councilor from District 8, Ed Flynn, our City Councilor and City Council President from District 2, Aaron Michaelwitz, yep, there he is, our State Representative from the 3rd Suffolk, Jay Livingstone, State Representative from 8th Suffolk, and Lydia Edwards, our new State Senator from the 1st Suffolk and Middlesex District. Thank you very much.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. As mentioned, I'm Kenzie. I'm the District 8 City Councilor. I'm very strong supporter of the Groundwater Trust. Really pleased the whole council was able to support increasing the funding from the city this year. And feeling like it's especially appropriate for us to be holding this forum in this room since we're underground. So here the pilings are not only beneath you, but also beside you in at least some direction. But just really wanted to stress how much it is going to take all of us to really push for these green infrastructure shifts that the mayor mentioned, and the fact that the Groundwater Trust has really been in the vanguard of that. And so the more we can do it everywhere in the city, I think that, often when we talk about the things that we build together in community and require trust and verification and working together, we think about building from the ground up. And the Groundwater Trust is proof that actually that work extends even beneath the surface. And it really just is a marker, I think, for all of us of what it means to invest in common good. So pleased to be here this evening. And let me introduce my colleague, State Representative Jay Livingstone.
Thank you, Kenzie.
Well, thank you for coming tonight, and thank you to the Groundwater Trust, particularly Christian Simonelli and his predecessor, Elliot Laffer, sorry. The work of the Groundwater Trust has been incredible. Every year there are more wells, more monitoring. We have a greater sense of protection for the structures throughout this city and throughout the region. And it's also personal, as a resident of Back Bay with a building, with an apartment, it's particularly important, but there's so much at stake in the city without this work. And I'm so glad that it's happening. I'm so glad that the people set it up years ago. Always happy to support it, but also heartened to see so many of you that are interested in learning more about it. So thank you. And I will introduce my colleague, State Senator Lydia Edwards. Thank you.
I echo everyone else's comments and thanking you for being here today. I live in East Boston. I now represent the Back Bay as part of the 3rd Suffolk, and I represent also Beacon Hill. So much of my district is on pilings, and so much of its future and its ability to develop and its ability to literally exist depends on the conversations we're having today. So I'm so excited that we're here having that conversation. I just want to specifically shout out Christian Simonelli for all of the deep conversations he had with me as a city councilor and educating me. And I also wanted to again shout out Mayor Wu and the extensive amount of work she not only displayed very quickly of what she's demonstrating, that this is the nexus of climate change. This is the nexus of dealing with our relationship with the water, but also in really being responsible and looking at being environmental stewards. So this is that conversation, and I think because we're having it now and we're taking it so seriously, we can make sure that our future has a very bright and beautiful path. So thank you. And I will now introduce my colleague in state government, Representative Aaron Michaelwitz.
Lydia. I've been around long enough that I remember Elliot was in charge of this organization, and I served with Elliot for many years. And you know, I want to thank you all for your continued commitment to this discussion. You know, I cut my teeth in politics, really, and one of the things I did, you know, was doing it through the groundwater conversation that we were having back in the mid-2000s throughout, you know, all the neighborhoods in my district, but also Back Bay and East Boston and beyond. And you know, that was the original kind of environmental kind of conversation that we were having about you know, rising tides and climate resiliency and those kinds of conversations. We were talking about protecting you know, what was underneath us and making sure that we were advocates and fearful on that. And I think that the GCOG piece was critical. I don't think people totally understand exactly how important that was to developments here in the city and into the downtown neighborhoods. And Christian has done a wonderful job in continuing that, carrying on Elliot's legacy, I guess I can call it, right, at this point. But I just want to thank you all for you know, your continued advocacy and continue to, you know, fight for this. And you know, us at the State House, we're always listening. We're always willing to be partners with the state and with the mayor and with the council and making sure that this gets the appropriate amount of attention that it deserves. So thank you for having me. And without further ado, I will pass it over to my colleague, Eddie Flynn.
Thank you, Representative. I'm honored to be here and to thank the wonderful partnership the City of Boston has with our state delegation. We're fortunate to have strong leaders in the State House that really support the City of Boston on so many issues. I just want to echo what Mayor Wu mentioned about this is an environmental justice issue as well. And I had the opportunity several years ago to go with the water and sewer to a well in East Boston. They were inspecting it and doing some repair work. And it was great to see the working relationship various city departments had with each other. It was the Groundwater Trust, it was the Public Works, it was the Boston Water and Sewer Commission, the police detail, but everybody working together on logistics to make sure these services were there for the residents of Boston. So Christian, just want to say thank you to you and the team, and also to Mayor Wu for her wonderful team as well, bringing everybody together in this wonderful building, the Boston Public Library. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for all our elected officials. I don't think we can really stress how important it is to have supporters in the City Council and the state legislature of the mission of the Groundwater Trust. It's not only themselves, but their staff have always listened to us, and we have always greater needs and objectives down the line to have even a stronger, not only trust, but to protect the groundwater as far as we can in Boston. And as was mentioned, the expansion of the GCOD most recently was a great step in that regard. I'd like to introduce now sort of our next part of our program, which is Boston's groundwater issue, the past and the present. And I'd like to start with, I'm sorry. Let's see, where am I? Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Garrett Dash Nelson is the president and head curator of the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. He's an historical geographer whose work focuses on the relationship between community structure, geographic units, and political ideology. Garrett, you here? Come on up. Thanks very much.
All right. Well, it's great to see everybody here. This is actually the first time I've been speaking in Rab Hall since the pandemic began, so it's really nice to be back. As Robert mentioned, I represent the Leventhal Map and Education Center. If you haven't had the chance to visit us or to work with us, the Leventhal Center is an independent research and education center in a deep and enduring partnership with the Boston Public Library. We're located upstairs on the first floor of the McKim Building. We care for the library's internationally significant collection of maps and geography materials, but perhaps more importantly, we're a center that brings together conversations about people, places, environment, and space here in Boston, in New England, and around the world. And in that capacity, we ask all sorts of questions about how are the places that we live shaped over centuries of change in this city, around the world, driven by politicians, engineers, ordinary citizens, activists, all working together to create the kinds of things that we see in our map collections. Now, Christian and the board invited me to share with you the results of a kind of research puzzle that we did at the center about a year ago. And that puzzle is, we all know that Boston is a unique city. It sits on a lot of made land. What you see there is the historic outline of Boston before colonial settlement overlaid on top of a modern map. We all know that. It's taught to us in school. It's kind of one of the factoids that people think about when they think about the geography of Boston. But how much is that land worth today? Boston's also one of the most expensive cities on the entire planet. Land in Boston is some of the most expensive real estate anywhere in the entire world. So all of this land that has been made over the course of nearly 2 centuries of geographic modifications to Boston landscape, how do we put a dollar value on it in 2021, 2022? I want to do a little wisdom of crowds here and have you all guess the answer to this before we get to it. And so I'm going to ask everyone to raise their hands and put them down as we get to a number that you think seems reasonable. How many think that more than $1 million of land sits on made land? I'll give you a hint. It is more than $1 million. So you should all have your hands up. How about 10 million? Put your hands down as you think we're getting past the mark. 100 million? 500 million? $1 billion? 10 billion? 50 billion? 100 billion? $1 trillion? It's not quite $1 trillion. It's somewhere in between there. We'll get to the answer. So one of the reasons we can answer this question is because Bostonians have been making very good maps of the city from before the colonial period. Indigenous peoples of what we now call Boston were cartographers and map makers of their own. Most of what we have are documents from the colonial period and beyond. And Bostonians have been interested in this question of shoreline change. This is a map from 1895 at exactly the same time that this building, not this wing of the building, but the McKim building was opening as the Central Library's new home, showing 100 years of shoreline change in the city. And if you zoom in, here's where we're standing. That green border is the early 19th century shoreline of Boston. You can see the BPL is literally on the edge of a wetlandy area to the east and open water marshland to the west. So because we have all of these historic maps, we can also create modern GIS data out of that information. This is our GIS information about historic Boston shoreline you can find on the Leventhal Center's open data portal. That information has been digitized for a number of scholarly research projects that have close connections to our work. The original Mapping Boston book, published with Norman Leventhal's support in the 1990s, the more recent Atlas of Boston History, edited by Nancy Seischels, from which we derive this modern information that we can feed into a computer about Boston's changing shoreline. This is our complicated spatial analysis. One thing we like to do is to educate people from kindergartners all the way up to university postdoctoral researchers about how to use maps and geographic information. So we put together this spatial analysis script basically to look at Boston's contemporary tax parcel data compared to this pre-modern, pre-colonial shoreline to answer this question. I should say, if you're a data nerd, you can run this script yourself. You can check our work. We love doing open data work. And you get this map on the left. This is a map of all of Boston's tax parcels. The tax parcels that are in dark blue are the tax parcels that sit entirely on land that didn't exist as of 1630. The paler blue are tax parcels that overlap that border. So part of them sit on made land and part of them sit on land that did exist prior to European colonization. Just to zoom in on this, here's the Back Bay. You can see all those hundreds of parcels, row houses along Column Ave. That large blue parcel is the Public Garden, which sits entirely on made land. The one to its east is Boston Common, which is half on, half off. We can connect that to the city's open data property assessment to basically tally up how much are all those parcels worth today. So we're going to get the answer to that question. Turns out that $36 billion of tax-assessed land as of 2020 sits on parcels that would not have existed as land prior to the European colonization of Massachusetts. If you include all the parcels that are partly on, partly off made land, you get to $54 billion of Boston's tax base that sit somewhat on made land. On all of those parcels, the city raises $650 million in yearly revenue from its property taxes as of 2020. That's more than a quarter of the city's total revenues from property taxes that are sitting on these invented parcels of land. And there's a couple caveats here. We're not including the value of all the parcels that the city doesn't assess. So this building takes up an entire city block. According to the city, it's worth $0. Of course, it's not really worth $0. That's just what the assessor says it's worth. We're also not including all the parcels that are on the edges of our data set. It only goes so far up the Charles. It's also not including Cambridge or Chelsea or other municipalities that also sit partly on made land. So that's a statistic. That's a kind of factoid that you can take with you. It's a bit eye-popping. $54 billion is a lot of money. A quarter of the city's tax base is a very large chunk of the city's revenue. But what I want to end with is a bit of a provocation. What does it mean that a huge part of the city's fiscal base, that a large part of the city's population, that a huge amount of modern monetary value sits on a landscape that was made by public action, that was made by regulatory regimes more than 100 years old? It invites us into the kinds of questions which we are very lucky to have a mayoral administration which is trying to answer, about how our environmental challenges always, in the past, the present, in the future, also social challenges, about how we live together, about how we regulate and organize our common life. We've got an exhibition up in the center that you can visit for free 6 days a week called More or Less in Common, Environment and Justice in the Human Landscape, which investigates some of these questions. I'd love to have you stop by. We look at maps of the city, including the city's climate-ready Boston data set in an original map that we've created at the center to try to visualize some of these social and environmental questions. We're also really lucky to have organizations like the Boston Groundwater Trust, which are organizing and creating change around these issues at the local scale. So I'll leave it at that. I know we've got lots of interesting stuff in the discussion today, but if maybe you can scan this with your phone. I tried to make it so that you can point your cell phone camera. So it'll take you right to our analysis that I just shared with you. If you want to read about it in more depth, zoom into any of the maps or explore our historic and contemporary collections. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks for being here, and I'll be here after the conversation to answer any questions as well.
All right. I think it's worth more than $0, right? That's like. I'd like to now bring up our executive director, Christian Simonelli. I don't really need to introduce him. I think all the elected officials and the mayor already have done that. But Christian has basically the heart and soul of the Boston Groundwater Trust. He is the person who interacts most frequently with both our elected officials, many of our city and state officials, and is a tireless advocate on behalf of the Groundwater Trust. He basically took the lead on expanding the GCOD. He took the lead on the amendments that went through the city council. I've worked closely with Christian. I haven't been on the trust very long, and I think it's been a great partnership between Christian and the members of the trust, moving our mission forward. And without further ado, Christian Simonelli, please come up. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate it, particularly the elected officials as well for showing up here today. I know their schedules are always jam-packed. Before I begin, I would like to just call out some of our trustees that are here tonight. Tim Mitchell, if you could stand up. Tim Mitchell was a co-chair for close to 25 years of the trust. Has really played an instrumental role in keeping the trust at the forefront. Peter Schillen represents Ellis South End neighborhood. He's been on the board for over 10 years. Janine Comerford represents the Greater Boston Real Estate Board. And Leah Kamhai is around here somewhere from the Fenway CDC. There she is, Leah. Thank you. Appreciate it. So I would like to thank, obviously, the library as well for hosting us. and haleontologists for providing refreshments, which will be provided at the end of this forum. What we're going to do is we're going to play our first video that we had put together now, almost hard to believe, almost 4 years ago. And what it really does is it tells everybody really what the issue is and really what we're trying to do as an organization. I feel like a lot of the people here already did that spoke, but it's always sort of difficult to imagine something that you can't see, and these videos do a pretty good job of that, if I don't say so myself. So sit back and enjoy for about 5 minutes.
The Boston Groundwater Trust is a city entity that was established by the Boston City Council in 1986 to monitor groundwater levels. And the Groundwater Trust monitors groundwater levels because the buildings are supported on wooden pilings, and those wooden pilings need to remain submerged below the groundwater table. If the groundwater table drops, the pilings become exposed to air, they rot, and the building starts to settle and become essentially unsafe.
This is probably representative of the upper 1.5 to 2 feet of a top of a wood pile from a building here in Boston that had to be repaired because those piles were deteriorated. The city of Boston back in colonial times, which is around 1630, 1650 time frame, was basically a peninsula as it is today, but it was much smaller. And then eventually it started to burst at the seams, and there was a need to create land.
So they filled in Back Bay, Fenway, South End over the period of about 30 years. They also filled in areas of the North End, majority of East Boston, Fort Point Channel.
There was probably 6 major fillings that occurred that created what Boston is today.
After that, they had land to build on. And the period of the late 1800s to the early 1900s, those buildings were supported on wooden pilings if they were on filled land.
Not every building in Boston that's on wood piles has the tops of the piles at the same elevation and at an elevation that is below groundwater. As time has gone on and Boston has become more developed, there's been less ability to replenish the ground with groundwater because it's just a much more impervious boundary. As soon as the water table drops and stays down for a certain period of time, that wood becomes exposed to oxygen. And the oxygen creates an environment for bacteria and bugs to basically grow. And when those bugs grow, they attack the wood and they eat the wood, and that's how they survive. So what happens is you go from, say, a tree or a wood pile that might be 10 or 12 inches in diameter that's holding up granite blocks, that's then holding up brick walls. It goes from 10 inches to about 2 or 3 inches, or in some cases it just completely deteriorates. And so what happens is the support of those blocks in the wall is lost. And the ground, which is the filled land, wasn't good ground to begin with, and so the buildings settle. And what usually happens is none of the piles will deteriorate at the same time. So you get different conditions at a front of a building versus a back of a building. And what happens is instead of the building settling evenly, one part settles, the other doesn't. And when that happens, the brick cracks, or your nicely finished walls will crack, or you can't open doors and windows, or you just have problems with sort of the house itself. And so that's the problem. That's what we're trying to identify. And if we do identify it, then we try to repair that problem.
The city and ultimately the residents look to us as a resource. You know, we're the information guys, so to speak. People want to know where the groundwater levels are, foundation information, piling cutoff information. We have that. And our primary purpose is to record and report on the groundwater levels, make recommendations to solve the problems, and inform people. Let the people know of this issue, why it's important to maintain groundwater levels, that these buildings are in fact on wood pilings, because the first thing you would think of a building is concrete or steel.
We monitor groundwater levels through a series of groundwater observation wells that are in the public way. So there are roughly 800 observation wells spread throughout all the areas of the city where there are wood piling supported structures. Every 5 to 6 weeks, we read all 800 wells, and then we start in East Boston. We finish up in the southern portion of Back Bay. Once we finish there, we go right back to the beginning and we start all over again. And it's a process that usually is about 7 to 8 times a year. We read the whole well network. If someone calls us to say, I have a building here, is it at risk? So we look at our groundwater elevation data, we'll look at our pile cutoff elevation data, which gives us the height of the pilings, and then we'll make a recommendation off that, whether or not they should seek out additional assistance. And ultimately at that point, then it would lead to contacting a geotechnical engineer, a structural engineer to come out. They'll come out, they'll take a look at the building and give a more professional assessment and advise on what to do from there. If the Groundwater Trust didn't exist and this well network wasn't established, you'd be putting thousands of buildings at risk.
So, that's the story. Thank you for coming. I do want to highlight this map here because a lot of people, when they think about this, they always say, oh yeah, the Back Bay is on fill and the little area Lower Beacon Hill's on fill. It's a Back Bay thing, it's a Lower Beacon Hill thing. It's a filled lands thing. That's what this is. So that's why we have this map here to highlight all the really areas of the city that are affected. And all these areas that I highlight are areas that we have observation wells, which are indicated in the lower right-hand corner by that cast iron box. So out of our roughly 813 wells, we installed about 617. And as Gary mentioned off the top, we secured funds in 2002 from the Environmental Bond Bill in the amount of $1.6 million. We also obtained a grant for $192,000 from the EPA. In addition to those wells that we put in, we also get wells that are installed in the public way. So if any entity, any construction company, any engineering firm wants to put observation wells in the public way, they have to go through PIC, apply for a permit. We're part of that application. And at the end, instead of the well being decommissioned once it's no longer useful to them, ultimately they turn it over to us. And we actually have 81 of those wells that have been installed over the years. We also have agreements with property owners, so we do read wells on the interior buildings, such as the Old South Church, for example. We read about 6 wells under their property, and that's all part of our observation well network that's on our website. We recently updated our website to not only include the observation well data that we have, but also include the building foundation data that we have in one place. We had them in 2 separate spots on the website, but now when a resident calls me or an engineer calls me, we sort of walk through the map, and this is where the groundwater levels are in this particular area. This is what we have for building information, whether or not the building is in fact on wood, whether it's on concrete, whether it's even stated that it's on earth, whether or not it's been underpinned. And obviously we're adding to this on a daily basis with the readings, and we're adding to this on hopefully what we try to get new data every week on the buildings as much as we can, not only scouring the building inspector reports and the original building permits, but also, anytime we have an engineering firm or a client that says, hey, we're taking a look at our foundation, would you like a copy of the test report? We say yes, and we put that information up on our website. Moving forward, what we'd like to do is we would like to automate a bunch of observation wells with remote sensing devices. And we currently have 5 units deployed out right now that are working, that are taking continuous readings since March. They seem to be working pretty well. We'd like to keep them in place for about a year before we make a decision on purchasing an additional units. But having these units in place would really allow us to learn about trouble spots sooner, rather than manually going out and reading the wells, which we'll always do. In between the sort of 5 to 6 week period when we're not reading the well, we can have devices in place that can tell us, really what's happening. And it's significant because for us, in that we can sort of tailor the time that the water levels are measured. We could change the frequency to every 5 minutes to every hour. If we know a significant rain event is coming, we can increase the frequency of the readings, and we can see sort of what the impact a particular rainfall event may have in a certain area. The Groundwater Conservation Overlay District was mentioned off the top, and this is really the most sort of significant progress, in my view, that's been made since the Groundwater Trust was reestablished in 1997. So it was created in 2006. It was amended in 2007, and we recently modified and expanded in 2021. When you look at the map, you see the areas that are highlighted and outlined in red, are areas that are now part of the G-Cod that weren't part of the G-Cod before. And quite simply, the reason is they weren't part of the G-Cod before is because we didn't know anything about the water levels, we didn't know anything about the buildings in the area. Fast forward, 15 years later, we've acquired all this information and we felt it was appropriate to now include those areas. And you see the largest area to the top of that map is East Boston. The sole purpose initially of the G-Cod was to eliminate leak paths. And what I mean by that is any new building that's constructed, any underground parking that's installed, anybody that puts in a deep basement has to certify to us or through the Article 80 process to the BPDA that it's watertight and that it's engineered not to have a negative impact on the groundwater table, to have no sump pumps, to have no underdrains. And that's really significant because this is the stuff that can draw down the groundwater table. Somebody doing something that, oh, gee, anywhere else you can pump water to keep a basement dry here, it's absolutely the worst thing that you can do. Also, increase the amount of water that's going into the ground. So take those roof drains, instead of having them go into the storm system, redirect them into an engineered recharge system under the ground. So basically, just picture taking your roof drains and putting them into an engineered structured dry well beneath the building or adjacent to a building. The City-State Groundwater Working Group, this is where really all the work is done and where the positive impact on groundwater levels, it really shines through. This was signed in 2005, a memorandum of understanding by us, the city, and then all these city and state agencies. And it was a commitment by all of us to come every quarter, share information, for us to stand up and say, these are where the water levels are low, this is where the problem areas are, and then for this group to go out, inspect the infrastructure, and if it was found to be deficient, if it was leaking, repair it. And I'll actually show you an example of one of those repairs. Hopefully, we have the potential to expand the mission of this group to also explore solutions for green infrastructure. Maybe this can be a group that can really look at, wide-scale, significant pilot projects for green infrastructure to really help, our mission and the city's mission on more GSI. So when we talk about underground infrastructure, this is what we mean. We mean sewers, we mean manholes, we mean tunnels. All this stuff is great, provides a service to the buildings and to the building owners, but what happens if it leaks? What happens if there's a crack? What happens if it settles? On our website, we have a groundwater underground infrastructure tab that details specific areas where we had depressed groundwater levels, and then through our upgraded map this summer, we were actually able to access ArcGIS story maps. And what those are is when you click on that image on Dartmouth Street, for example, it'll take you to a new window, and it'll open you up into an environment that'll have a series of maps and graphs and a narrative that will say, here's where the groundwater levels were, here's where we found the leak, and this is what happened when the leak was fixed. And this is an example of one of those areas. So this was right at the corner of Beacon and Fairfield Street. And this is a graph that illustrates groundwater, which is indicated by the blue line, and then precipitation, which is indicated by the magenta line. And as you can see, the blue line sort of dances along a little bit around elevation 3. And the image on the right are pilings below the building. And that upside down triangle is meant to signify groundwater. So you can see here, for the purposes of this, that sometimes, and a good majority of the time for the better part of about a year, the wood pilings here were exposed, except when you got a significant amount of rain. You see that blue line spike up, pretty consistent with the precipitation event, but then it would immediately drop right back down. So what mystified us when we were making the manual readings in between was, why is this well always low? Well, when you put the data logger in there and it takes a reading every hour, it tells us that the water level was temporarily spiked with the rain, but then that sewer that was leaking would draw the groundwater away. Okay? And so we said to Water and Sewer, hey, what do you got in the area? And John Sullivan said, leave me alone. So John said, give me a week. So he went out, his team went out and took a look, and they performed what we call dye tests. So basically what they did is they opened one of our wells, they put in some green dye in our well, and they see if it showed up in their sewer. Sure enough, they had a sewer right at elevation 3 where that groundwater level was that was leaking. Water was coming in. They designed a repair solution, and what happened, it was a spike. So the scale is a little bit tough to make out, but basically you see the jump right there around sort of the beginning of December. That was a 2-foot rise in the groundwater levels, and that happened in less than 48 hours. You could see previously all the water level data before that. The groundwater table is really not moving around a whole lot. It's pretty much staying there, except when you get a significant rain event. Really anything over an inch is when it spiked, and then it dropped back down. That's the impact that sewers and drains and stuff that leaks can have. And you can see today from the meter reading that we have this past April, really before the drought impacted, the elevation now is at 6.98. So overall, going back to where it was around elevation 3, you have almost a 4-foot increase in the groundwater level in that area. And you can see the water now is well above the tops of those piles under that building. The Ellis neighborhood in the south end, this is an area where we have active recharge wells that are indicated by these triangles. And there's approximately 36.7 gallons a minute of water going into the ground to maintain the groundwater levels in this area and to keep the pilings wet. If we turn off all these recharge wells, the water level would drop. And really the result of the depressed groundwater levels in this area is a result of the construction of the southwest corridor and a combination of some other factors. But needless to say, it's extremely difficult fix, expensive fix, and really complicated to get to that spot to repair it. So this was a solution that the City State Groundwater Working Group came up with, and the MBTA is the one ultimately that funds the water for these wells on an annual basis. And the water levels stay up. As I mentioned, we had a shutdown test in 2012 indicated on this graph, and you can see as soon as we turn the recharge off for about a month, the water levels dropped about almost 2 feet. But as soon as we turned it back on, it came back up. And what we've seen since that time is obviously more periods, prolonged periods of drought. And what we've seen is that in our data loggers here in these 2 wells specifically, you can see the water level drop below and then, stay down because we're not getting rain. These systems were designed to have around 40, 45 inches of precipitation a year. Well, when we're not getting that, these systems are going to need to be turned up because you can see all the way up really to this year, they're falling below the threshold of 5, which is where most of the piling cutoffs are. So we got to pump up the water in those wells, unfortunately, until we get some precipitation, and then we can sort of, turn them back. Initially, the systems were designed to run around 40 gallons a minute or so. They were as high as 54 gallons a minute, but we've really, with the years, we really tried to fine-tune them and tweak them to use the least amount of water possible to keep the water levels up in this area. But unfortunately, during times like this, we need to increase the flow. The mayor had talked about 2016 being the driest summer that we ever had, and it was. And what we saw were groundwater levels that were extremely low, some of the lowest levels that we had seen all time. And so the table on the right is actually just the precipitation values that we've been tracking going all the way back to 2000. And what I did was I pulled out a 5-month snapshot and I said, gee, I wonder where this year falls sort of over this 23 years that we've been doing this. It's actually the worst 5-month total that we've had ever. Okay, the only year that even comes close to it is 2016, where we had just over an inch more. And you can see on the bottom there, the average that we should have around now is close to 20 inches, and we have just over 8. So it just goes to show you how significant the lack of rain that we've had, and really the lack of precip that we've had. But the good news is the wells tell a different story. The wells tell us that we actually have more wells above elevation 5 and less wells below elevation 5 than we did in 2016. It's a direct result, in my opinion, of 2 things. One, we have more recharge systems now than we did back in 2016, so anything that did fall was helping replenish the groundwater table more. But really more significantly, we have less leaks in the system now than we did back in 2016. And again, through the sole efforts of the members of the City State Groundwater Working Group, the groundwater's got nowhere to go but up, as you could see in that graph before, when a sewer or a manhole or whatever is causing the leak is ultimately remedied. Here's what we're hoping to avoid. This is the process of underpinning a building.
In the normal course of you finding out there's a problem to the point where you actually start the work, it can oftentimes be a few months. Unfortunately, what it takes more often than not to figure out if there's a problem is you have to dig what's called an exploratory test pit, which is you physically have to dig an excavation to go down and look at the wood piles. Once you've seen a pile that's deteriorated, and more importantly, that the water table is below, you're not going to be able to bring that water table up likely, and therefore you should do a repair. Pit underpinning is a series of small excavations similar to those exploratory excavations that allow you to go down and expose the wood piles. It's all dug by hand, so you have a series of 5 or 6 guys that are digging a hole, bracing the hole as you go deeper with timbers so that people can get inside and do the work as you get deeper. You've got pumps that have to pump groundwater because we have to go below the groundwater table to get to an elevation that we can cut the piles. But instead of just exposing them, we have to go down below the granite blocks that they're supporting we have to get in underneath the wall to expose every pile that's beneath the wall. When we go in and cut these rotted wood piles, it's usually just the top 1 or 2 feet that's rotted, but we're cutting 4 or 5 feet because that ties back to getting to an elevation that's a few feet below normal groundwater levels and at least at the elevation or slightly lower than the deepest utility. Each pile, as you're cutting it one by one, you're replacing that section you removed of wood with a steel post, and it comes back up to the granite block. And so at the end of cutting out a series of 7 or 8 piles, you have a series of these posts. And once you've posted those piles up, what you then do is you usually put a form up and then encase everything in concrete. And then once you turn off your pumps where you're dewatering to make all this work happen, water table will rise back up and it'll be above the wood piles, and you will have sort of some insurance in the future that you've now got a wood pile 2 or 3 feet below the groundwater table. And so after you've done that all in one pit that might be 8 feet long along your wall, you'll come out of that pit and you'll move to an adjacent pit next to it. So it's a series of pits working yourself all around the building and at interior columns or walls, one by one. And then eventually you have a whole new foundation that's dropped the wood piles below the groundwater table.
So once they do all that for those 8 piles, you do it all over again the next week. So if a building has 400 piles underneath it and you're doing 8 piles at a time and you're doing a pit a week, that's where the months-long process comes in.
You usually will find that the cost to repair the piles beneath that building might be around $250,000. And it can fluctuate up or down, you know, depending on a lot of things, much of which is what you, the owner, will allow the contractor to have for access to the building. So it can be a much more costly process when you are forced to be in a position to still, say, live and access that lower level of the building.
It's never rewarding to find out that a building's being underpinned. What's rewarding for us is that for the homeowner, if they go to sell the building, they can say, our piles are fine, we had them fixed, this building's on a whole brand new foundation.
But I'd like to think that Boston now is ahead of the curve, so to speak, and more proactive in identifying problems and helping people identify problems, and not allowing things to get to a situation where it could become a problem.
We want to show people this is unpleasant, this is expensive. If we weren't monitoring groundwater levels, this would be done on a much larger scale, much more frequently, and it wouldn't just be this one spot on this street, it would be multiple streets in multiple neighborhoods. We can't control what happened 130, 140 years ago, but we can control what's happening now.
So that's why we do what we do, to prevent that from happening on a massive scale. So where else is this happening? You know, that's usually the first question I get from a lot of people. Is anybody else dealing with this stuff? Europe is, particularly Amsterdam. And we have a speaker virtually joining us tonight from Amsterdam. And his name is Wilco Koning, K-O-N-I-N-G. And he's actually going to walk us through how Amsterdam is tackling this issue.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. I will be saying next for every next slide. So if you can start the next slide. My name is Wilco Koning. I work for the City of Amsterdam Waternet, which is actually the water company for the City of Amsterdam. Can show the next slide, please. Then we are actually responsible for water safety, water quality, drinking water, sewage and drainage within Amsterdam. And Amsterdam is built in a delta with peat and clay ground layers and a challenging groundwater table. And a lot of the land is actually elevated from the former peat polders. So you can say it's made land. And if you talk about the groundwater, then the municipality and Waternet is not responsible for the groundwater table. But we have to respond if we find something happening to the groundwater table, like too low, too high, or rapid changes. And then we can search for the cause. Can be sewage or a leaking drinking water main. If that happens, then we repair it. And otherwise, we search for other causes. And then we can warn people, hey, something is going on and you have to take measures. Next, please. We have, we know the problems that can exist with groundwater table for a long time back. The old city of Amsterdam, including the expansion until about 1950-60, are all funded on wooden piles. So we have a lot of buildings within Amsterdam on wooden piles. Next, please. And you can see that we also are familiar with problems with foundations in Amsterdam. I have a few examples of the past where the foundations were not all too well, especially because of difference in groundwater tables. Next. And especially when we started construction with sewage systems, we started around 1913 with the first sewage system in the city. And we all found out quite fast that we need the monitoring of groundwater table in order to keep view if there's a leakage within the sewage system. Okay, next, please. And in particular, the sewage pipe could cause problems with lowering groundwater table and the effects you can see on a few of the pictures that I have over there. And we started monitoring for the groundwater table in 1935. Next, please. And at the moment, we have a total number of monitoring points or observation wells, as you call it, of 4,296 points, of which we have about 3,400 which are monitored by hand, about 6 times a year, immediate, and about almost 900 automated with loggers. And the automated, they differ. Some are they measure every day and some measure every hour. Most actually measure every day because we have just many points. It's a lot of data otherwise. Next, please. I was asked to tell a little bit about climate change as well. A picture of the city of Amsterdam there. Next, please. And if you talk about Amsterdam, then the precipitation, you can see that the precipitation is actually going up. So there's more rain falling if you look back from 1900 till now, from 768 millimeters a year, nowadays around 930. Next, please. And the numbers of days with heavy rainfall also increased from about 20 years to 24 years. And what it tells us is that there's more rain falling, but a lot of the rain is actually falling in a shorter amount of time. So we have more like the precipitation is more in gales, so to say. So we have heavier rain in shorter amount of time. And what's also is happening is that we have a lot more days with summer days, so warmer periods in between the gales. And especially in the warmer periods, you have very hefty rainfall. The problem with the hefty rainfall is that actually only a small amount of the rain goes to the groundwater table. So with warmer time, with more evaporation and rainfall in shorter bursts, which are more hefty with more water, you get actually less water to the groundwater table. Next, please. And that means that in the winter period, you get wet cellars. And with a high groundwater table, even the roots of trees can go rotting. And in the summertime, we have a low groundwater table with exposed wooden piles, which can cause damage to the wood piles, as already showed, I think. Next part. And if we look at the cover for wooden poles in this part, the Stadionbuurt, that's a part of Amsterdam. The green parts are okay. The yellow parts is also okay, but a bit at risk. And the red parts are exposed for a period of time, and with a chance of risk for damage, and with the brown parts are actually for a prolonged period of time they will be exposed to the groundwater, to oxygen will be above the groundwater table, and in time almost certain will have damage to the wood. Next, please. And I have a little model. We have made a model which actually validated on the actual monitoring of the wells, the precipitation and the evaporation. And if we take a climate scenario for Amsterdam for 2050, we can see that with only a few inches lower groundwater table, that the time and the number of times of exposure is exponentially much bigger, almost twice as much exposure to the foundation, with only a few inches. In this case, it's only about 2 or 3 inches lower groundwater table, with a change in climate that we expect to see around 2050. So the wood piles are actually in quite danger if you talk about it. Next slide, please. And that would mean that if you talk about the risk for the wooden piles, a repair in Amsterdam or in the Netherlands, you talk about repair between 40,000 to 100,000 euro per house. And the Netherlands has about 750,000 houses that are at risk. You talk about 40 billion euro. And for just Amsterdam, you're talking about around 200,000 houses, which would mean about 10.7 billion euros. And I'm not looking at municipal buildings, that's excluded actually. And if you talk about the canals in Amsterdam, which we are famous of, you also have the quays next to the canals, which are also funded on wooden piles. Next, please. Then you go to the responsibility of the house owner, and the house owner is actually responsible for the groundwater table on his own premises, and he's also responsible for the quality of his foundation, and it has to be good enough for normal activities like the sewage replacement, working on mains, working in the street, the neighbor when he works on his house. It all has to be possible. You have to have a good enough foundation for that, and the cost of repair and replacement of foundation is a responsibility for the house owner as well. But if we talk about that, next slide, please. It's actually for the municipality. It's easier to take measures. On the top picture, you see how we work. In this case, on private ground, with very small bed access, and below is in the public, in the street, where you have enough space, and it's easier to work. And especially the linear infrastructure, so to say, the streets that you have as public property are very suited to take measures and more cost-effective to take measures. That's why we in Amsterdam take measures in public grounds for groundwater to keep the groundwater table at bay. And it is also that the means for groundwater disposal are often public, like drainage system or waterways or things like that, especially in Amsterdam. Next slide, please. And what we try to do is, especially in the winter, we drain the water if there's an excess, and in summer we try to replenish it, and in order to keep a bit of a stable groundwater table. Next, please. One of the measures that we use are DIT drainage. It's drainage, infiltration, and transportation. The pipes are used to transport the water to where it's needed in order to be able to infiltrate it to the groundwater table, or just to drain it and take it away if the groundwater table is too high. And you can steer it with valves, or just connect it to the surface water. Next slide, please. And the effect of this drain is that we use in one street within the green square that you see over there. There's a 30 centimeters. That's about 12-inch difference elevation of the groundwater table, which is just enough to keep the wooden piles wet and below the groundwater level. Next, please. And on this slide, you can see the groundwater table since 75 to about 14 going down in time. And there was some leakage from the sewage. We repaired that, so you see a little bit going back, but it's not going back to the former level. And it meant that the wooden piles were still getting above the groundwater table. Next, please. And we took the measure with the DIT, with extra surface water, what we made to the street to replenish the groundwater. And in the red, you see the modeling that we made. It follows quite neat in 2017. And after measure, you see the modeling goes through, and the actual measuring of the water in blue is a lot higher. And in green, you see the difference between the two. And the median of that is about 13 centimeters or about 12 inches. So you can really see the effect that this measure has on the groundwater table. Next, please. What we also use is dry ditch or bioswales for storage of heavy rainfall, but also for replenishing of groundwater. We use actually two types. One type is only when the water in the streets rises, so only with heavy rainfall we use it, and the first rain goes then to the drainage or the sewage system, which takes also the most of the dirt and the filth of the streets. And we have a system where all the rain goes into the ditch, especially when we need to elevate the groundwater table. We take all the rain that is available. We also have some tests with permeable pavement, including ground improvement and storage on the ground. We use a free volume between the grains for the storage on the ground. So usually granular material. Next, please. And with the permeable pavements, we had some big difficulties, especially if you see the picture above. That's not real snow, but it is elm. The seeds of the elm, which is almost snow. And we have a lot of elms in the city of Amsterdam, and it actually clogged up the permeable street that we created over there. And the picture below, you see how we take full-scale test in order to measure how well the permeable pavement is working in this case. Next slide, please. And for the permeable streets, we have within the city of Amsterdam, we have the policy that we try to get the first 20 millimeters, about 0.78 inch, into the drainage system. And the next volume of 20 millimeter, we try to keep between the curbs or on the streets. And the last part of the volume that we try to work with, we try to get that into bioswales, dry ditches, or to surface water. But if we need to replenish the groundwater, then the first bit of water that falls, we also try to get it to bioswales or to infiltration in order to replenish the groundwater table. For permeable pavement, we also use felt between stones for the pavement in order to have a bigger infiltration. As I said, next slide, sorry. And next slide, please. This is the felt between the stones for pavement. And next slide, sorry. And we tested that as well, and we had a 10-year-old permeable pavement with felt, and the first infiltration test was with 32 millimeters an hour, and we made a second infiltration test, and it was 35 millimeters an hour after brush vacuum cleaning. So after good cleaning, it was a little bit better. And next, please. We also made a full-scale test of a bioswale, as you see over here. Next picture. Next slide. And we tested it, and the infiltration capacity of the biosol was actually much higher, with 200 millimeters an hour. So it's much higher. And especially in dry periods, the infiltration of these bioswales are very much higher. And we think that it's because with high grass and bushes, you have much more space for rainworm, beetles, and other insects to get a chance to open up the soil, which performs for infiltration much better than, for instance, a grass, short-capped grass or permeable pavements. Next slide, please. What we also tested is actually, I think you missed a few, but what we also tested is actually for trees. So we measured the precipitation of trees, and we found out actually that if you take the recharge of the groundwater, the difference between the water that's going to the groundwater and the evaporated water, that especially with elms, we measured with elms, that up to 60% of the recharge was actually used by trees. So trees use a big part of the groundwater, especially in summer. So they have a big effect on the groundwater as well. Yeah, it was also talking about the heat wave effect that you have with these cities. In cities it's normal, much warmer than it is outside of the city. And trees are very important for a cooling effect for cities, especially before the evaporation of groundwater through leaves. They need the groundwater for that. And of course the shades that leaves provide. So we actually measured the amount of water that trees use, and a tree can use between 60 liters a day and more than 300 or 400 liters a day, depending on how big a tree is. And so it's also important to have a good groundwater level in order to keep your trees healthy and to keep them with enough leaves in order to provide a bit of cooling effect in the summer as well. And well, this was what I wanted to tell. So if people have questions, they can send them in the Q&A or in the chat.
Wilco, thank you. If you can't hear that, you basically brought the house down with your presentation, so it was good. Get some sleep. I know it's really late over there. Thanks very much.
It's a bit later. I try to follow it to the end because I'm very interested in the topic.
Great.
So thank you, Christian.
All right. Stay tuned. Talk to you soon. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, now we'll welcome up our co-chair, Robert Whitney, to run the panel.
Thanks. That was great. Wow. I want some of that bioswell stuff. That sounded great. Now we're going to talk a little bit about, we have a panel which we're going to talk a little about climate change. Some of the things we've been talking about tonight, we've heard about sort of what's been going on in the present, what the past, where we came from, and sort of looking a little bit ahead. How will climate change have an effect on the levels of groundwater in the city, particularly in the GCOD area? What is the impact of climate changing over the next years? And how will it affect the city and the groundwater levels? And also maybe a little bit on what we can do about it and how we can sort of address some of the issues that we look forward. So our panel tonight is going to be, I'm just going to read them and invite them up. So why don't you come up, panelists? You know where you're supposed to go. And I will start with Jane Knott, who is the founder of JFK Environmental Services, LLC, doing business as Hydro Predictions, an environmental consulting firm specializing in groundwater hydrology, groundwater remediation, climate change adaptation. Her expertise includes groundwater monitoring and data analysis, groundwater flow, and contaminant transport modeling. She holds a PhD in civil and environmental engineering from the University of New Hampshire, master's degree in civil and environmental engineering from MIT, bachelor's degree in geology and physics from Mount Holyoke College. Next on our panel is Matt O'Malley, the first ever Chief Sustainability Officer for Vicinity Energy, North America's largest district energy system. He joined Vicinity in 2022 to head up the company's decarbonization efforts. Prior to that, Matt spent 11 years as a member of the Boston City Council, culminating with his service as council president. While in office, he was known as the environmental counselor, which is true, writing and passing a significant number of environmental initiatives, including plastic bag reduction ordinance, community choice energy, curbside composting, gas leak spill, Birdo and Birdo 2.0. He lives with his family in West Roxbury, and today is his birthday. So let's wish him a happy birthday. There you're welcome. There you go. And this is where you wanted to be. I knew that. Kate England, next on our panel, is the city's first ever director of green initiatives. In this role, she's leading the city's efforts to plan, build, maintain green infrastructure as part of the mayor's Green New Deal for Boston. She began working for this role just recently in past August, and she will be responsible for incorporating green infrastructure into all of the city of Boston's project plans, regulations, and operations, and will be heading the Green Initiative Working Group to ensure that city departments have uniform approach to green infrastructure implementation. She holds bachelor's degrees from Northeastern University in political science, international affairs, and a master's in environmental science from my alma mater, Brown University, where she wrote her master's thesis on utilizing stormwater utilities to incentivize the implementation of green infrastructure. Next on our panel is John Sullivan, who has been with the Boston Water and Sewer Commission for over 50 years, serving as the chief engineer for over 30 of those years. He holds an engineering degree from UMass Amherst and MBA from Northeastern University, as well as a master's degree in emergency management from the Massachusetts Maritime Academy. And he's the past president of the National Association of Clean Water Agencies, chairman of the Water Information Sharing and Analysis Center. Dr. Vandana Rao is the director of water policy at the Massachusetts Executive Office for Energy and Environmental Affairs, EEA, where she's responsible for developing policy and providing direction to the Secretary of EEA on water resource issues across the state, including issues such as water quality and quantity, drought, water conservation, wastewater, habitat, watershed management, climate change impacts from and to the water resources and stormwater. She also chairs the State Drought Management Task Force and is the executive director of the Massachusetts Water Resources Commission. She was the editor also of the Massachusetts Climate Change Adaptation Report in 2011. She received her PhD in environmental policy and a certificate in dispute resolution from the University of Massachusetts in Boston, master's in environmental science from the University of Maryland, and bachelor's in life sciences from the University of Bombay in India. Great panel, huh? So we're going to start off. Each of the panelists is going to have a brief presentation, and then we're going to sort of go into an open conversation about some of the issues we've been talking about. And we're going to start with Dr. Knott. Why don't you come over here so you can see the screen? And the clicker for side presentation is right here.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Rob. It's great to be here tonight. It's great to see so many people here, and the presentations before ours have been terrific. It's really been very interesting. It's a fascinating topic. I've spent my whole career studying groundwater, and recently have really looked at the issue of groundwater and climate change, basically the effects of climate change on groundwater levels. So I participated in a study in this it's called the GBRAG study. You're probably familiar with the Climate Ready Boston report that was done in 2016. And the GBRAG report has just come out in June of 2022. And that's basically a report that gives an update on the Climate Ready Boston report, because as you know, things change in terms of what we understand with climate change. And so this climate change report called GBRAG report, GBRAG stands for the Greater Boston Research Advisory Group. It was sponsored by, or it was funded by the Barr Foundation, and the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, MAPC, was very, very instrumental in getting this done. Climate Ready Boston essentially was Boston, looking at climate change and the effects in Boston. So this study not only updated that report, but it also looked at the greater Boston area, the 101 communities around Boston in the MAPC area. So this presentation is going to be quite brief. I think we're all going to give brief presentations, so I'll just give a little touch of what we found in the report. The figure on the right is showing the recharge, and I think you've understood that from the talks today, is that most groundwater recharge occurs in the winter and the spring and in the fall, and it drops off in the summertime. Basically, that figure is showing that it's dropping to zero, and that's mainly because of evaporation and evapotranspiration that happens in the summer months. The figure to you, it's your right, is a projection, essentially, and there's a number of curves there, but what I really wanted you to see is that in January, February, and March, it's projected that the groundwater recharge will decrease significantly, so in the spring. And in the fall, it's projected with climate change that the recharge will increase. So that steep drop in the spring is pretty important because the recharge in the spring has always been important in the New England area. So when we take a look at, that was a seasonal projection, but when we take a look at the annual projection, it shows that in the near term, in say up to 2030, we're seeing just a very little drop in recharge, maybe some increase, small increase. But as we project out toward 2020, toward 2100, we see that the annual recharge rate is dropping off significantly. So in looking, in the report we looked at recharge, groundwater recharge, but we also looked at another effect of climate change on groundwater levels. And that's the effect of sea level rise on groundwater levels. So this is a study that I worked on in New Hampshire with the University of New Hampshire, basically looking at coastal New Hampshire and taking a look at how sea level rise will affect groundwater levels. And what you can see here, this is the Gulf of Maine to the right, and the Piscataqua River, and then Great Bay. The colors that you're seeing here is it's showing areas where groundwater will rise with sea level rise. The red color is that's basically the magnitude as a percentage of sea level rise. So the red would be like 88 to 100% of sea level rise, the magnitude. So right next to the coast, you'll see groundwater rising almost as much as sea level. And then as you move back from the coast, it's less and less. So the area of groundwater rise, we're calling the groundwater rise zone. And in coastal New Hampshire, the projections were that that groundwater rise zone would go inland about 5 kilometers or 3 miles. And that's a lot further than the surface water flooding. So, and what I'm talking about is groundwater rise. So it's rising groundwater levels underground. It doesn't mean that the groundwater is flooding that area. It's just groundwater rise. And groundwater rise won't be any more than what you're getting in sea level rise. So if you're getting 2 feet of sea level rise, you're only going to see 2 feet of groundwater rise right next to the coast. So this is Portsmouth. It's just a zoom in of Portsmouth. Oh, it was supposed to change.
We lost my apologies. We lost the graphic there for
Okay. That's fine. So this is just, I was going to show what it looked like with 1 foot of sea level rise and 2 and 4 and 6. And this is up to 8 feet of sea level rise. So basically this is showing you the absolute worst case that we're projecting out to like 2022, 2200. So, but basically what you can see here is that groundwater rise is something that needs to be considered when you're thinking about climate change and also groundwater levels. The study that we did looked specifically at sea level rise affecting groundwater levels. We did not look at changing recharge. So the recharge in our modeling was held constant. So the next step in this work is really to look at the effect of both. And you can do that with a groundwater model. That's it. Thank you.
There you go. Thank you, Rob. I will keep my presentation brief because I really want to get into some of the Q&A. I know my colleagues up here do as well, and I've seen David Leonard throw people out of the library at closing time, and I do not want to see that happen. Great to be with all of you. Before I begin, I wanted to acknowledge two of my colleagues, Don Sylvia and Rick Smith, who are with me from Vicinity, who've been working incredibly closely and hard and well with Christian and his team on a really innovative plan on what we're talking about. So I'm going to give you the brief overview. As has mentioned, I am Vicinity Energy's first ever Chief Sustainability Officer. And what's drawn me to this organization is that it's old, established technology that is constantly innovating to meet this moment. And that's what we have to do, and that is not dissimilar to what the Groundwater Trust is doing each and every day, taking advantage of some old tried and true technology, but working constantly to update their processes and making sure that it continues to thrive. So very, very briefly, what is District Energy? It's our steam system. We have a major plant in Kendall Square in Cambridge. We serve about 70 million square feet of property in Boston and Cambridge, mostly the downtown core, mostly the GCOD overlay district, which I'll get to in a second. And it's very old technology. Its origins go back to the Roman aqueducts, and we've seen it to use in great success here in Boston. And the thing that I appreciate about District Energy is that it's fuel agnostic. 120 years ago, they used coal, and then oil, and then gas. And now we are embarking on our decarbonization efforts, beginning in Boston and Cambridge. We have ordered our first electric boiler. We are decommissioning a giant gas boiler the size of this room this month, or probably in October, to be candid. And we are going to implement a really innovative three-pronged approach to how we decarbonize. It's very, high level. It's electric boilers with a direct interconnect to our grid. Once wind energy comes online, it is going to be wonderfully fortuitous on how we can leverage that peak hours of wind and our peak hours for having to heat and cool buildings. Plus, it's a ground source heat pump, the largest in North America. Certainly the United States. I say the North America, but Vancouver is doing something similar as well. I'm hoping we can beat them. That will literally leverage energy from the Charles River to help create steam. That's something remarkable for those of us who can remember when the Charles River was literally the punchline of a national joke on something that was polluted. We're going to help make it a renewable resource. And then thermal storage capability, the likes of which have never been seen before, and again, will allow us to help leverage wind energy and other renewable sources to best highlight how we're going to, the peak times that we need this. We're doing this currently. But our commitment to the environment, to sustainability, does not stop there, because it really is other ways that we can do it, other ways that we can meet this moment in time, innovating old technology to meet the catastrophic climate change effects that we are already seeing each and every day. And the topic of tonight's discussion is, does climate change affect groundwater levels? Of course it does. It affects every aspect of our life. So how can we address it? How can we get serious about it? How can we think outside the box in terms of how we're going to fix it? And one of the things that we're going to do is leverage our district energy system. This, by the way, is the system. You can see that the shaded area is the GCOD, and then the pipes are existing infrastructure, and then some new planned interconnect and expansions. So what is the water cycle of steam? It begins as river water or from Boston Water and Sewer. We create it into steam. Then there's condensate, and then there's either plant return. Some of the condensate goes back to our plant. Some goes into the sewer. Some we're going to put into recharge wells, which will then go into groundwater or the bay, which then river water. It's the cycle. It is the circular economy. So what we're talking about tonight
is working with the Groundwater Trust, and this is already well underway. We're working with some of the incredible folks who are committed to this as well, using some of our condensate, our steam condensate, and using that to inject into groundwater recharge wells. Now, the beauty of this, it's the mighty hat trick in hockey. It will save our customers money. It will save us money. It will conserve water. It will help better efficiencies for our buildings, and it will also allow for that constant level that we need. We've seen some great examples. Christian talked about, Rob talked about, our friend from Amsterdam talked about how these weather events, how some of these droughts can have a just chilling impact on groundwater levels. If Massachusetts had to deal with what California did in a 20-year super drought, we would be seeing absolutely catastrophic consequences because of that. We can help keep those water tables level. We can use our condensate as we talk about the circular economy. I just want you to think, several years from now, not too far off in the distance, we could be having a wind turbine off Boston Harbor, spinning, creating electricity that goes to our electric boiler, that creates steam, that goes and helps heat or cool one of our buildings. We then capture some of that condensate to go inject into some of our groundwater wells to keep that water table level. It's a remarkable thing. It's the story of this city. It's the story of our company. It's the story of the Groundwater Trust. Innovative technology, or established technology, which is constantly innovating. So we are delighted to be here and to partner with some incredible friends. Things are already happening underway. Some well-known institutional players are already beginning to see how we can make this work, but this is something that will have a profound impact, and we are so delighted to partner with the Groundwater Trust to make this a reality. It's the right thing to do for our customers, it's the right thing to do for our city, and it is the right thing to do for our planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll hear from Kate.
Hello, everyone. I will also do my best to keep my remarks short. As has been mentioned, my name is Kate England. I'm the City of Boston's inaugural Director of Green Infrastructure. Most of what I'm going to have up on the screen behind me are images of green infrastructure features that have been installed in the City of Boston, because we're all very proud of our local green infrastructure. Our friend from Amsterdam, Wilco, gave half of my presentation for me. Normally, I'm the one who stands at the podium and sings the praises of green infrastructure and discusses why it's important and why it's essential to have any kind of functioning city. The mayor spoke eloquently about how green infrastructure has to be at the center of our climate resilience work, and obviously has to be at the center of our groundwater work as well. So the image on the screen right now is a picture of Central Square in East Boston. It's one of our GCOD neighborhoods, especially now that we've had the recently expanded GCOD. Christian and I met 2016 or 2017 for the first time when I was giving a presentation, as the mayor mentioned, about one of these projects, actually many of these projects. And the whole point of giving these presentations at the time was to talk about the value of green infrastructure and its ability to get stormwater back into the ground. This project is a really beautiful example of cross-agency collaboration. Many departments at the City of Boston worked together to make this project happen. Central Square was a collaboration of Boston Transportation, Boston Public Works, Boston Parks, Boston Water and Sewer, all working together to create a large green infrastructure installation that met goals of multiple departments. So again, I'm just going to click through some of these so you can see. The image that's up on the screen right now is showing the installation of a permeable paver system with a subsurface stone infiltration area with some beautiful trees planted in it. So what you're seeing right now is the stone area that goes underneath your permeable pavers. The workers are currently laying the pavers themselves. And oh no, we lost the the after photo. But you can kind of see the after here where you've got the permeable pavers that are covering your ground surface and a lot of very healthy, happy, large trees. So the reason that I wanted to talk about Central Square is to give you all a little bit of information about what I have been asked to do at the City of Boston. So my role was created primarily to facilitate projects like this, to facilitate cross-agency collaboration, cross-departmental collaboration, so that we can design and build projects like this in parks, in public right-of-ways, in plazas, in open spaces to help get large amounts of stormwater back into the ground. Now, the wonderful thing about green infrastructure and why I love to sing its praises so much is that green infrastructure has a lot of co-benefits. Now, that's a fancy way of saying that in addition to the fact that it gets stormwater back into the ground, which we all love to help maintain our groundwater levels, it also adds tree canopy, which helps us with urban heat island effect. It also creates biodiversity in our cities. It also has wonderful benefits for humans who live in these spaces. It creates gathering places that people want to be in, that are cooler, that are beautiful, and that communities can be proud of. So a couple of other examples of projects, because again, I know you've been told a couple of times tonight why green infrastructure is so great. So just showing you some images of what we have in the city and what we'd like to continue to implement through my work and then through the work of other city departments. This is an image of Audubon Circle. It is in the Fenway neighborhood, again, also within our GCOD. This project is, again, a large collaboration project. It included some multimodal transportation, some beautiful rain gardens, and a lot of really wonderful features that exist entirely in the right-of-way. So the reason that I keep talking about our right-of-ways is that a lot of the neighborhoods that our GCOD exist within are very heavily developed. They have a lot of buildings that are built to the edges of parcels. Open space can be somewhat limited. And so one of the things that we need to look at is how do you fit green infrastructure into a city where you have buildings built to the edge of your parcels and you don't have a lot of open space to work with. So our, again, Wilco mentioned this in Amsterdam, that they do a lot of work in the right-of-way, and the projects that I'm showing you now are all right-of-way projects that are possible and will be implemented in similar form throughout the city as long as you all let me continue to do it. So clicking through again, this is another site in the city. This is New England Avenue in Dorchester. This project has some more surface vegetated features, those bioswales that you heard Wilco mention from his presentation. So in this instance, the project, again, collaboration between multiple city departments, and the site was chosen initially for a traffic calming project that was identified by Boston Transportation. The initial plan was to have paint or hatches on the roadway that would chicane or wiggle the roadway a little bit, that would hopefully slow traffic down, as well as narrowing the road, which gave us a little bit of space to work with on the edges. So when we had the initial conversations about New England Avenue and heard that they were going to be painting the roadway, we said rather than creating hatched areas, let's make some bioswales. Let's make some bioretention areas. Let's make actual physical features that have plants in them that provide habitat for pollinators and green space for neighborhoods that need it. So these images are the result of this wonderful surficial green infrastructure installation. We have some really great pollinator species, we tried a couple of different types of bump outs. So if you're ever in Dorchester and your GPS routes you somewhere, but you can veer off and go to New England Ave, I recommend driving down it just to see another example of what's possible. All right, and the last one that I'm going to show you is a relatively new installation. This one is in Nubian Square, formerly referred to as Dudley Square. And this installation is largely located in front of the new Boston Public Library branch that was just renovated. So again, another example of a lot of hardworking green infrastructure in a relatively tight, heavily developed neighborhood that I think looks pretty beautiful and provides wonderful co-benefits, but also gets a whole lot of stormwater back into the ground. So we have a lot of information on the Boston Groundwater Trust website that shows data from monitoring wells. If you look at monitoring wells in any of the neighborhoods that we just talked about, and you can find one that's near a green infrastructure feature, you'll see some really interesting data that shows that there is an increase in groundwater levels around green infrastructure features. It helps to keep them more consistent throughout the year. We saw, actually, we were looking at the mapping the other day, and we saw there's an alleyway that was put in a few years ago, alleyway 543, which is a porous asphalt installation that the Boston Groundwater Trust worked on with Public Works, Boston Water and Sewer, and the Charles River Watershed Association. There are 2 monitoring wells in that project, and so if you want to see some groundwater data around a green infrastructure feature compared to one maybe just one street over, and you can compare the water levels, it's really fascinating, and I highly recommend it. Okay, so that's the end of my pictures. I'm going to stop there. Again, I appreciate you all making time to be here, and I look forward to continuing to implement work like this in the city and to essentially just keep talking your ears off about how wonderful green infrastructure is and hoping that we get some support from you all as well. Thank you so much. Okay. Carrying around my thing.
Well, like everyone has said, good evening. I am John Sullivan. I've worked there 50 years in the water and sewer systems in the city of Boston. And I, fortunately or unfortunately, signed a new 5-year contract, so you get 5 more years for you. 2 fun facts. The biggest in the GCOT area, the biggest potential culprit to lower the groundwater is the water and sewer systems serving your homes and your home itself, which connects to our pipe, because they're all down below the groundwater. And any type of crack in that could cause the depletion of groundwater. That's fact number 1 that you may not have realized. The other fact you don't care about, it's I get more phone calls from Christian than I do from my wife in any given week. So the Boston Water Sewer has been working on this issue since 1985. We first got involved with Brimmer Street, where there was a lawsuit on it. What are we going to do? We look back in our records. We all talk about the groundwater wells. The WPA put them in the 1930s. Why did they do that? The front of this library collapsed in 1929, along with the stock market, but all by itself due to a leaky sewer in Dartmouth Street. The technology at the time was we put a dam in the sewer and simply backed it up so that the water couldn't leak and the piles could remain wet. Those sewers were replaced in 1996 because we had all kinds of good technology, and we were learning. So it's been a long process, a long learning process. We worked in forming that. I survived Elliot Laffer. I'm working on trying to survive Christian, and it's coming along. That's what we do. And so we're all over everything. Anything rain, anything sewer, that's us. And I do have one slide, maybe. Yep. Oh, so I need help with technology. All right. I think that's it. Very good. All right. So just one slide. My GIS department tries to get me cool with cool colors. I'm not sure I like these. What these represent are locations in the city of Boston where we have had people install groundwater recharge units. And what we require, and you heard it from Amsterdam, we require the volume of 1 inch of water to be brought into caverns to slowly infiltrate into the water. And we picked the 1 inch because 88% of the rainfall that occurs here in Boston is 1 inch or lower. So we can capture 88% of the storms. Higher than that, these caverns would be too big and too expensive to put in, and we can let the water go over. But we are capturing a ton of water. But you can see it's not just GCOT, we're doing it across the city. We do it because we also then can clean the water. It's a pollution prevention issue. So it's very important for us to do that. Most of these, as I mentioned, were private, because all the construction in the city of Boston, we mandate that occur. Now you wonder some of the big buildings in town where they have no land. The buildings in town have gigantic tanks in them, and we pump that water, or they pump that water, out into wells into the city street, slowly at 2 to 3 gallons a minute, recharging the groundwater. So I just want to make sure you all understand we're on this thing, we've been doing it. The key is, as Kate mentioned, we haven't done a lot in the public ways. And we have all kinds of ideas of how to do this. Now, the idea is it sounds nice that we can go through all this infiltration. You ever dig a street in the city of Boston, try to find a place you can put an infiltration basin. That is a challenge. But we're up for it. We can do it. We can work with the sidewalks. We can work with public works. We can infiltrate. But we like capturing volume. Jumping to climate change, we're all about climate change. Since 2010, we have been studying climate change. We have rain gauges throughout the city. We have 10 of them. We capture the amount of rain you see in 5-minute increments. You will find no one in New England that captures it in 5-minute increments. NOAA doesn't capture it in 5-minute increments. They capture it in 15. Why do we do 5? Because the intensity of the rain is hotter. We need to understand what the trends are. So all that data is publicly available on our website. We also built an inundation model, which is really fun to play with. It took a lot of time, a lot of engineering behind it. But you can put in a storm. You can decide if it's 2030 or 2070. You can decide how high the sea level may be. And it'll tell you if the city does nothing, how much will flood. And it's not good news. So if you want to get depressed, get on there, put in 2070 with a high tide, and look at your house. Your bedroom should be on the 3rd floor. So those of you with 2 stories, I'm just letting you know. We're going to improve that. We're going to improve it over the next couple of years. Our commission has given us the funding. We are going to then put in the city's barriers that they're proposing, along with the work we're going to be proposing of how to pump it out. And we're going to show you that if we all get together and we build the right things, the city has a great chance of surviving the worst storms in 2070. And we are continually learning. We're redoing all our models. We're redoing everything about climate change so that we're up to date, because we don't want to overspend our money. Or, I'm sorry, we don't want to overspend your money, because if you can recall, once a month, we send you this little hello, a couple of little pamphlets, and please pay. So it's very important that we work on this thing together as a group. We will continue to work with the group of the Boston Groundwater Trust. As I said, we have new people working on it. We have new technologies. We got instruments that can climb through sewers. We get instruments that can actually line sewers. Nobody has to go in them, and it all works. And our next move is to see what can we do about the private laterals owned by the homeowner, many of which are leaking right where they connect with us, and using technologies where we can do the work and cure that problem and make sure the groundwater doesn't infect it. And don't forget, if you've got pumps in your cellar and you're nice and dry because you dug it a little deeper, you're part of the problem. So, and it's not just water sewer. Those roads that go deep, they, you know, that maybe that orange line is working well, but I'm just praying they're not pumping well. We've been through this all over the place. The roads can do it, buildings can do it, but we are the biggest potential culprit. We admit it, but we have solutions coming. So that's all I got. Looking forward to questions.
Hi, everybody. I know I probably stand between you and some wonderful panel discussion and refreshments. I'm going to try and make this short and sweet. My name is Vandana Rao. I work at the Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs and work on a whole host of issues. And today I just want to talk about some of the reasons why doing this amazing work that my co-panelists are doing really makes sense. I'm going to show you a little bit about history and the data, and some projections as to why, again, having the exact types of approaches that my co-panelists have already advocated for and are working so hard on really makes sense as we move forward and as we get through this century and into the next century, hopefully having dealt with in a much more better and thoughtful and more natural sort of way dealing with climate change and the impacts it's having on us. So what you have on the screen are a couple of shots from events in the recent past that New England has experienced. So we are seeing some crazy storms, some very high intensive rainfall events that you've heard of throughout the evening today. And I just wanted to bring some pictures to show that. And we're seeing a lot more of this where not only are people wading in waist-deep water and their cars are completely submerged or immersed in that water, but basements are being flooded and the first floor of many commercial establishments have completely been decimated. And why am I talking about flooding while we're all talking about the lack of enough water or the lack of enough water for recharge? Oop. Did I press something I shouldn't have? Okay. And we're also seeing something like this. This was supposed to have a little animation here, but in 2016, in October of 2016, the city of Worcester had, over a weekend, received over 4 inches of water in a single 24-hour time period. Now, as you can see from the photographs here, it created quite a havoc to the city. This was particularly telling because this happened right in the middle of our worst drought that we've seen in 60 years. 2016 was very close to our drought of record, which occurred in the 1960s. So here we are in a region that was in what was a level 4 drought at that time out of 5 levels of drought, while streets were being flooded and inundated, and everybody thought, oh, the drought is gone. Not really, because that water did not really recharge. It just was flashy, went through the streets, went into the rivers, went into the storm drain, and was out of there before it barely got a chance to recharge and help the drought. So this is what we're seeing. We're seeing sort of the juxtaposition of these heavy rain events causing damage like this to infrastructure, to natural resources, to property, all sorts of flooding. And at the top right, I had to put that map there from the National Climate Assessment that shows that in the past 60 or so years in New England, we are seeing 71% increase in this high type of heavy precipitation events. And so why is this important? Because while that's happening, we're also seeing a lot more of these types of droughts. And in particular in the last 20 years, we have seen droughts where, in the bottom left, the Quabbin Reservoir, I don't think that part of the reservoir was seen in 30 or 40 years, exposed. Similarly, the Scituate Reservoir at the bottom right, and of course, many of our rivers and streams were drying up in 2016, as they did this year, as they did in 2020, as they did in 2017 and 2021. And so this map here is really, this graph here is showing you these high and low events. We're seeing a lot more of them with greater frequency and greater intensity. So, so on top of that blue trend line that you see, the top circle, which is the broader circle in red, is showing you when we had these really high intensive rain events. But the ones at the bottom are the droughts. And what we're seeing is a lot more of these droughts. This is just Massachusetts. I'm not even talking about the rest of New England or the rest of the country or the world. In Massachusetts, we're seeing a lot more of droughts. And droughts are really not associated with this part of the country. We only think of the Midwest or California. We have our own types of droughts. And it's particularly troubling in the context of climate change because of how the temperature has been faring. So I just picked a few of these maps to show you what's been going on with the temperature vis-a-vis the northeast of Massachusetts. So the map on the left is from 2016, so that severe drought that we had, the August of 2016. And the period of record there is 122 years. And that August was the worst or the hottest in that 122-year record. The top right is from the August of 2018, where in that 124-year record, it was the 124th worst year in terms of how high or how hot it was. And bottom right is August of 2020, where similarly, it was the hottest month. So it's just telling you a story that each year is getting worse and temperatures are continuing to rise and continuing to stay at these high levels for a continued period of time. Why is that important? Let's look a little bit more on what's going on with the temperature here. The projections on the right, which is what I really wanted to show, is although we're seeing some of this happen already over the last 6 to 8 years, it's projected to continue. We're going to see more of them over the summer. And our coldest days or coldest temperatures that we've been able to record for this part of the country, those are also going to be warming up. So overall, temperature ain't doing too well. And Massachusetts is going to look more like North Carolina. That may suit someone like me who grew up in the tropics really well, but it has lots of other impacts for so many other aspects of our life here in Massachusetts that we've gotten accustomed to. So I did want, I try not to put too many numbers on a slide, but this particular one was very telling for us. Since 2016, what's been troubling was how groundwater and stream flow have fared in our region. We've received some years of below normal rainfall. Certainly in 2016, the average was 37 inches. In 2017, it was 47 inches, and our average each year is about 48 inches a year. That's what Massachusetts gets. So we do see some years with below normal rainfall. But our stream flows and groundwater have seen record lows. And when I say record lows, it's comparing what it is at that point of time with how it's ever been at that period of time for all years in the past that we've had records. And in Massachusetts, we've been blessed with records going back to the late 1800s. So we have 100, 120, 130, 140 years of record in some cases. And we're seeing the worst, the lowest levels now. And so what's going on? Why? I mean, the precipitation is not that low. So there's something that's off. There's something that's just not quite right in the way water is moving through our system that is causing these record lows in our streams as well as in our groundwater. And so if we just take one basin, which I found is somewhere close to where we are right now, on the Neponset River, and if you look on the left, it's the drought of the 60s, and the right is the period between 2015 and 2017 when we had our next drought. And in the drought of the 60s time period with a 50-inch deficit, you see where the stream flow is in that red circle. And on the right side, with just 25 inches of a deficit, we are seeing even greater decreases in stream flow. So something's happening. Something has happened between the 1960s and now that has changed this. Two guesses. One guess. Development, impervious cover, lack of recharge. And therein we come back full circle to how the lack of recharge in the city of Boston for sure, but also other parts of Massachusetts is really creating a havoc on so many different systems. So I just have some quick takeaways. Precip is changing. We're getting more hot days. There are a lot more short-term droughts, as we're already seeing. In the last 7 years, between 2016 and now, 5 of those years have seen drought for at least 5 months of the year. That's unprecedented for Massachusetts. And we're seeing what's called this flash droughts, where this high temperature that we're seeing is interacting with the precipitation and exacerbating the drought that we already have. It's intensifying it. It's making it come quicker, move quicker, and last longer. And we're seeing these record low stream flows. So what we really need to do is think hard about how we're developing. What are we doing with our impervious cover? It's all about when we talk in political circles, oh, we need to grow, the economy needs to grow. We can, but let's do it in a way that is not messing with this basic hydrological system that we've benefited from for centuries. So the bottom line is land use really does matter. It matters where we develop, how we develop, and what we're doing with our open space, our natural recharge areas, our green infrastructure, and where and how we develop really matters. So I'll stop right there. Thank you.
I'm on or not. We're going to try to do a few questions sort of to the panel as a whole. And I think sort of how you ended is I think how we should start, is that with the increased development in Boston, particularly the Seaport area, but also in Back Bay and East Boston and everywhere else, there's an increase obviously in increase in concrete and less pervious soils and less open space. And one of the questions I guess I wanted to sort of start with is sort of looking ahead. How can we deal with that at the same time recognizing that so much, at least through the past, of the groundwater has been maintained through natural recharge, through basically rainwater. And now, looking ahead to the future, we'll be able to rely on that less. So to the extent that there's more development and less rainwater, how do we look at that as a city, both from an industry standpoint, from a municipal standpoint, and a state standpoint? What kinds of strategies should we be thinking about, and how should we implement them? And let anybody start who wants to start.
I'll tackle it kind of quickly, because I think, Rob, you hit a great point that it can't just be the private sector and government and quasi-public agencies. It has to be all of the above working together. And I think Mayor Wu deserves enormous credit. She is a visionary on this stuff. It has been. People like Kenzie Bach, my dear colleague, have been incredible leaders on this and continue to be. So it's policy, but it's also a different approach to business. So when we passed the building emissions reduction disclosure ordinance, it was under the fact that we are seeing a building boom continue, so we need to have a stronger building code on how these buildings are built. And 2/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions come from buildings. They're not come from cars, they're not from the airplanes overhead, they're actually from buildings. So if we retrofit buildings, if we put some aggressive but achievable benchmarks in place, you're going to see the impact. So that's on more carbon emissions, but more than that, it's on how we can both allow for development, but not make the trade-off that we're going to have heat islands or we're going to have just concrete. And it's using new strategies. So, you know, I was talking about what we're going to do with the condensate from our steam. We have some buildings, some current clients that use it for irrigation, that use it for cooling towers, that use it for toilet water, all these things that you can do. So to use it now for groundwater recharge is something that, to my knowledge, hasn't been done anywhere, and there are district energy systems across the planet. We'll be, I believe, piloting it here in Boston, but that's just another way that we can allow for this old technology to address the needs that are very different than were 10, 20, 100 years ago, and that's one of the ways that we can do it. So it's all of the above. It's policy, and it's practice, and it's businesses that are doing their fair share to, again, meet this moment.
Okay. I also think the public space, we've addressed all the private as all the reconstruction goes. We're capturing, we're putting in the ground. We have not done that in the public spaces. And what Kate is proposing with the heat island issue, with the trees, and if we can work together when we rebuild streets to take that stormwater and before we send it out to the river polluted, we put it into systems that put it back in the groundwater, help the trees survive, but also level off the groundwater and clean the water because nature cleans itself. So we put it there. So that's what we need to do is we rebuild our public spaces, which have been only minimally touched. I think we'll be able to accomplish a lot.
Yeah, Kate?
Yeah, so to kind of take what John said just a step farther, and apparently my mic's on now, we look at our groundwater levels, for example, around green infrastructure features, and we see that even in smaller rain events, you're seeing increases in groundwater levels where you have green infrastructure that is capturing runoff that is falling on sidewalks, buildings, streets that would otherwise go into catch basins and then go to water bodies untreated, as John mentioned. So even in times of drought, which doesn't necessarily mean no rain, it just means less rain, getting every drop of rain that is falling back into the ground is going to help us to maintain those groundwater levels and is going to help us to have a more sustainable, I guess, building stock because you're not going to be dealing with the sagging and rotting that we have been talking about with piles today. So I want to kind of make it clear to everybody that green infrastructure has a lot of benefits on a large scale, but it also has a lot of benefits just capturing small amounts of rain that is falling and getting it back into the ground. So naturally, before development, everything that falls on the ground kind of infiltrates where it falls. We're trying to allow nature to do what it does best, mimic those natural hydrologic processes in heavily paved urban areas.
So from the science, I was going to go ahead, but I was going to say from the science part as well. I just want to let you know, unfortunately, because we're running late, we only have about 2 or 3 more minutes for the panel, but go ahead. I was going to say, I'd like to hear your perspective.
Okay, so I would just echo what's been said about the green infrastructure and also make the point that while green infrastructure is great for recharging the aquifer, which we're not doing when we have impervious surfaces, but it's also good for handling the floods. So it gives 2 benefits. It puts the water where it should be, which is in the ground, which is going to filter it. And then you don't have it running down the streets when you get too much water. So
kind of a perfect solution for an area like ours that gets too much rain and too little rain all at the same time.
Exactly.
How does our future look, by the way? I think you were ending in terms of, I like the term flash drought too. I think that's great. It's such a great term. But in sort of the closing sort of thoughts, looking down the road, I noticed some of yours goes out 100 years, looking really down. In terms of the Boston areas and the GCOT areas and sort of bringing us back to where we are physically and, sort of by topic, how does it really look? Does it look like these are going to be changes we need to do looking ahead? Because it's not like, oh, it's going to get better in 10 years. This is now how it's going to be. It's going to be this way, and we need to be serious in how we create our infrastructure, how we get industry involved in participating in developing ideas and new kinds of use for excess water and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think we have a choice anymore in terms of whether or not to do this. It's about how fast and how expansive can our projects really be. As we've seen, these kinds of green infrastructures, some of the panelists have talked about help with floods, help with certainly with recharge and drought. But I think one of the key things that a city like Boston needs is to bring that temperature down. And so these types of projects, because of the heat island effect, we know we see that all across the city with the amount of concrete and hard surfaces we have, they really will bring that temperature down. And so it feels like you have a win-win-win for so many things. Your city gets much more livable. It's a beautiful space. You have areas where children can play. And now when you walk around some parts of the city, it's just gray. And being able to bring back that green essence and mimicking the natural sort of hydrological system at the background while providing a much more livable and beautiful space for our communities, I think is the way to go, and will prepare us much better for these extremes that we are seeing. And in a world where, although there are these predictions for climate change, that also is evolving as more greenhouse gases are going into the atmosphere and we are messing with the global circulation models, et cetera. So with what we know, these approaches will really put us a long way ahead of where we need to be in terms of preparing and being more resilient.
Great. Let's have that round of applause for the panel.